Hi, everyone, and welcome to Politics in Prose. I'm Jana Coleus, the events coordinator, and I'd like to welcome all of you here on behalf of the owners, Carla Cohen and Barbara Mead. It's fantastic to have Leo Marks here. I've been looking forward to this evening for quite some time. For Leo, I hope that these are comfortable surroundings. I hope that they would be, because, of course, he grew up around books at the famed London store Marks & Co., where his father was proprietor, and where, when you read Between Silk and Cyanide, you'll find out that that was the site of the first code that he actually cracked at a very tender age. Mr. Marks, skipping ahead actually, after the war, has gone on to have a writing career and has worked on screenplays. One of his screenplays became the 60s classic thriller Peeping Tom that some of you may have seen. And but now going back to the bulk of this book, of course, the war, in Between Silk and Cyanide, he tells the extraordinary story of the Allied code-making operation, which he developed with others. And it is just a tremendous tale, and he tells it so entertainingly. And there are incredible moments in this book where you realize that all could have been lost, or all could have been, at best, more difficult, and there are times when things were more difficult than they needed to be, and there are harrowing moments, and there are narrow escapes, and everything that you could imagine. But of course, these things weren't necessarily known then, and are only known now. These incidents, as I said, are tremendous and exciting, but what I finally figured out sort of partway through the book and then ended up realizing was that in many ways this is, of course, Leo's book, but it is very much a book for the many heroes and heroines who helped with this effort and who helped win this war, and did so at great expense, and sometimes the ultimate expense, and is just probably dedicated to all of them in a way. And I know that you're going to enjoy it, and I can't wait to hear from Leo himself. So just wanted to thank you for coming, and thank you very much for being here.
Ladies and gentlemen, I would like to take the same kind of gamble with you as I've recently taken in a number of London bookshops. I propose to read to you the whole of the first page of a book. If it does not make you want to know how this book continues and ends, thank you very much for listening, and I hope we shall meet again some other time. So here is page 1. And that is a good start. In January 1942, I was escorted to the war by my parents in case I couldn't find it or met with an accident on the way. In one hand, I clutched my railway warrant, the first prize I had ever won. In the other, I held a carefully wrapped black market chicken. My mother, who'd begun seriously the day I was called up, protectively beside me, praying that the train would never arrive, cursing the Führer when she saw that it had, and blessing the porter who found me a seat. Mother would have taken my place if she could, and might have shortened the war if she had. My father, who was scarcely larger than the suitcases he insisted on carrying, was an antiquarian bookseller whose reading was confined to the spines of books and the contents of the Freemasons' Chronicle. His shop was called Marks & Co., and its address was 84 Charing Cross Road. He never read The Gentle Little Myth by Helen Humph. Long before it was published, he'd become one himself. My parents accompanied their only joint venture to the door of the train, and for the first time in 20 years prepared to relinquish him. Mother's farewell to her only child was the public's first glimpse of open-heart surgery. Late comers were offered a second. As I entered the carriage, clutching my chicken and bowler hat, she called out at the top of her voice, if he'd had one, "Look after my boy." The captain in the seat opposite me accepted the brief. To distract me from the spectacle of mother comforting father and the station master comforting them both, he silently proffered his cigarette case. I indicated my virgin pipe. "Going far, old son?" My security-minded nod convinced him, if mother's performance hadn't already, that I was being dispatched to some distant outpost of what remained of empire. I was, in fact, going all the way to a school for code breakers. I became mesmerized by codes at the age of 8. My father insisted several months before I was born that I was one day to run his bookshop. And he had a partner called Mark Cohen. But they decided it sounded better to call themselves Marks & Co. than Marks & Cohen. And as Mr. Cohen had no son, every Saturday morning I was taken by father to 84 Charing Cross Road to learn the value of books. It was strictly forbidden to read them. And one Saturday morning he produced a first edition of a book called The Gold Bug by Edgar Allan Poe. He paid, so he said, £6, 10 for it. And being in a generous mood, he was going to offer it to the Americans for about £800 because he was convinced they'd want it. He then instructed me to study it, not for its content, but for its value. And I discovered that this was a book about something called cipher. And it was also about a buried treasure. And the whereabouts of that buried treasure were in code. And this was my first exposure to code. Father had told me that any book in Marks & Co. above the cost of £5 was written in code at the back of the book. So I turned to the back of the book, and there were some figures. Now, he told me it had cost £6.10. So I examined these figures very, very carefully and realized what Marks & Co.'s code was. It was Marks Cohen, a figure under each letter. That was a very rewarding experience. But we had relatives at Leicester Square, a few hundred yards down the road. My uncles also had a very famous, rare bookshop. And I toddled down there and had a look at their code and found they were charging as exorbitant prices as my father, and their code was no more difficult to break. We also had relatives in Bond Street called Myers. Their code was no more difficult, and their profit margin no less exorbitant. And then, having found this interest in codes, I managed to cheat my way into a public school called St. Paul's. And we discovered in those days, and this was our first resistance movement operation, that all common entrance examinations were being held at the same time. But the papers were different. So I managed to set up a system whereby we compared examination papers with other public schools and relayed the results over the telephone. That was the first resistance movement operation with which one was associated. Problem was, we passed about 90%, and that was very serious. People do not pass their entrance exams as quickly as that. So I cheated my way into St. Paul's, was put in a very high form until one did some homework and was instantly demoted. Now, codes as a vocation suddenly becomes important in wartime. I wanted very much to invent them, and not quite knowing how to do this, sent samples of my codes to the War Office with a long curriculum vitae based loosely on fact. No more loosely than their replies, which said they were giving my letter immediate attention. So having made absolutely no progress whatsoever, I called upon a friend of my father's, who was a very senior police officer at Scotland Yard in the Special Branch, carrying my codes in a gas mask case and asking if he would kindly use his influence to introduce me to whoever taught people how to invent or break codes. And he must have suspended his judgment that day. He was a very keen Freemason, like father, and he must put the craft before the country, because I was interviewed by the High Master of a code-breaking school. And the first question he asked, really, was how one became interested in codes. I managed to duck that one, and to duck a few others, and was finally accepted, and was quite the worst pupil that school had ever known, because I didn't agree with the methods of teaching how to break codes, and was more interested in inventing them, and was so far behind the rest of my class that I took a code home, an exercise which I had photographed mentally, and worked a little hard on this, and managed to break it. And when I returned to code breaking school and showed the result, they thought I cheated, because this code was supposed to be a joint effort spread over roughly 3 days, and they therefore despaired of me altogether. And there was a place in London called Inter-Services Research Bureau, who were looking for somebody who knew a little about codes. And they decided, as they had no use for me, and Bletchley, our great code-breaking school, our great code-breaking institution, I wasn't considered good enough for that, and was therefore sent for an interview. Inter-Services Research Bureau. And the interview was conducted in the mistaken belief that I was the son of Sir Simon Marks, who owned Marks and Spencer. And this peculiar outfit was in reality Special Operations Executive, SOE, who had the responsibility from Churchill of putting sabotage agents into the field. And they decided that their code department, their agents' code department, needed someone to keep an eye on it. And they thought perhaps if they took on the son of Marks and Spencer, they might get canteen facilities from him. Well, I was no relation at all to Sir Simon, though I was at 3 schools with his son, and we used to toss a coin to see which of us would change his name. And I found I was accepted. And within a week of being accepted by SOE, Sir Simon granted us the canteen facilities, and I lived off the credit for that for the rest of the war. But I was about 22, decided to remain a civilian if it were possible, because you need then only call people sir if you really mean it, and discovered practically on the first day that SOE was sending agents into the field using poems as codes. Every resistance movement agent would be given a poem. This system had been inherited by SOE by an organization called C, Peacetime Intelligence. And C wanted to close us down from the moment we started. It was the start of a major civil war between us and C, which cost a great many lives. And C said, poems are what agents should use. They're what ours use. They're what yours should use. And the idiot, then in charge of signals, believed them. If he'd actually been told that C used chamber pots of transmitters, he'd have had SOE peeing in Morse. He was dedicated to absolutely anything that C told him to do. Now, I knew that an intelligent Boy Scout could break a poem code. That's one problem. Secondly, if an agent were caught and the enemy tortured him and he gave up that poem, they could read all his back traffic without further effort. And thirdly, it was a cumbersome nightmare of a system. And I tried to persuade SOE, poems must go. And in their place, we must have codes on silk, different for every single agent in the field. And when an agent sends a message, he must immediately cut away from the silk the used part of his code, burn it, and then he can't remember it if he's caught. Now, it took me 12 months to persuade SOE that this must happen. But if they lost their silks, they still had to continue using poems in reserve. Now, forgive me if I have to be technical here. If an agent used a well-known poem, and they all chose poems that they'd been taught at school, if the enemy broke one single message, they could mathematically reconstruct the 5 words of the poem that that agent had used. One poor devil chose the national anthem. 5 of the words, God save gracious King our. The Germans broke that message. God save that agent. Because they could mathematically reconstruct the words and they know the rest of the poem and they needn't bother to break any more traffic. So I decided agents must have original compositions for their poems, so that if the enemy break one message, at least they won't be able to guess the rest of the poem, and we'd buy a little more time for our agents. The average lifespan of a WT operator in those early days was 3 or so weeks. And if we used original compositions, we would extend it just a little. And I invited all the country sections to start writing poetry for their agents, and they thought there was an outbreak of insanity in the code department. So I started writing original compositions for agents. And leaping ahead, I one day met a very beautiful agent called Violette Zabo. Mischievous, brave, and a deadly shot with a rifle. She used to win all her money for cigarettes at shooting galleries. And she was very unhappy with the poem she was obliged to use. Now, I had written a poem for a girl I had very much hoped to marry, and she was killed in an air accident in Canada. And I went up on the roof of the building where I worked, looked up at the stars for signs of new pedestrians up there, and called out a bit of a poem, which I should have said to her when she was alive. And having met Violette Zabo, I thought, I wonder if she'd like this as a poem. And I didn't think that my intended fiancée would mind. So I asked her if she thought she could learn it. And she read it. And she wanted to use it. And then she had to speak it to me. The life that I have is all that I have, and the life that I have is yours. The love that I have of the life that I have is yours and yours and yours. A sleep I shall have, a rest I shall have, yet death will be but a pause for the peace of my years in the long green grass will be yours and yours and yours. And she looked very hard at me and said, "Who wrote this?" So I said, "I'll check up and let you know when you come back," feeling that she never would. And ultimately she was executed, aged 23. And I think it would have pleased her that a few weeks ago I had a letter from somebody, a stranger in France, who'd read this book. And he said that he and his wife read the poem to each other every night for 2 years because she was dying of cancer, and it gave them courage. And thank you for writing it, which puts a lot of things in proportion. Now, I finally won the victory, and silk codes were introduced into SOE. And we began to change the face of agents coding. It was a nightmare producing them on silk. And ultimately, the Americans helped us. If they did nothing else in the war of value, they helped us produce codes on silk. They felt sorry for us, and they found the silk we needed. But what you should know is that agents still continued using poems because they lost their codes, their silk codes, or didn't want to use them. And if they had to repeat those messages that were indecipherable, they'd be caught doing so. And I got a team of 400 girls who would work round the clock to make sure that there was no such thing as an indecipherable message. And we broke 90% of agents' indecipherables. And without those 400 potty girls, this never could have happened. But there was one exception. SOE had done a deal with General de Gaulle. We wanted his business. He didn't like the British, and had good reason. but decided he would deal with SOE if his agents could use his own secret French code. So SOE agreed to this without asking what code it was. And de Gaulle sent us copies of every single message he sent to the field and every single message he received from the field, and assured us that they were accurate. As we were not allowed to see the code, we couldn't know. But I noticed that whilst we were breaking 90% of our agents' indecipherable, Duke Street were making no attempt whatsoever to break free French indecipherable. I wasn't allowed to do a thing about this because we were not supposed to know what General de Gaulle's code was. And one night, a free French agent blew out his brains in the middle of a transmission because the Germans had broken in to the place where he was transmitting and would have caught him. And what he was transmitting was an indecipherable in secret French code. So I locked the door of my office and broke General de Gaulle's secret code. And there was no secret code. He was using the pathetic British poem code with a new indicator system, putting it to even greater strain. And from that moment onwards, every single message in secret French code I intercepted before it was sent to him, decoded it, and if it was accurate, it would go round to him at once. But if it were indecipherable, I broke it and re-encoded it accurately in secret French code so they could read their own messages. And ultimately, this was discovered by General de Gaulle. I will not weary you with the consequences. Now, all this time, great, great courage was shown by agents. And if they were caught, the first thing for which they would be tortured would be their code. Because if the enemy could get hold of it, they would then send messages on the agent's behalf and read orders back to everyone. So every time an agent was caught, we were tortured with him. And it became an obsession to give them silk codes of the safest possible kind. And over there is a selection of some of them. This is not the moment to take you through them. But most of them were constructed to waste the time of the enemy. Some of them were constructed to be caught by the Germans. And there was one nightmare situation where a great British general called Templar wanted to show the Germans that there was an active resistance movement in Germany where none existed. And his brief to me was, devise a code that can be found in Germany which will convince the Germans that there's an active resistance movement. Well, that is the actual original code that was devised to be found in Germany. But what this brilliant general did not tell me is how it was to be found, and he ultimately divulged that there was a double agent who'd cost a lot of British lives and a lot of German lives. And he was now in a prisoner of war camp in this country, and he was going to be sent back to Germany, he thought, on a mission. But in fact, his parachute would fail to open, and when he reached ground, there would be one of these silk codes on him. And that is how General Templar decided we would start to convince the Germans. that there was an active resistance movement in Germany. The thing he was slower to disclose is that I had to go down and brief this agent and absolutely convince him that he was going in on a major mission and he had to know his codes perfectly. So I was driven down with the general's escort to a prisoner of war camp, not very far from London, not far enough from London. And driving down, there were cages on either side, full of Germans, prisoners of war. And I spotted one enormous German bullying someone about my size. And I told the driver to pull up. And I walked up to the cage and stared at this general as if I knew who he was. And he looked very uncomfortable, and I continued to stare. And he began to perspire. And I turned away and then walked back and looked at him one last time, then returned to the car. And my escort says to Marx, "What the hell were you doing?" And I said, "I've always wanted to scare the shit out of a German soldier." And then went to meet the man who was going to be dropped and found dead. And to my horror, I liked him and briefed him very, very, very carefully. And this was one of the most delicate, controversial operations of the war, called Periwig, conceived by a brilliant General Templar who ultimately became Field Marshal Templar, and was so pleased with the code that was devised that ultimately he gave me his fountain pen, and I wrote the script of Peeping Tom with it. But there's been a great controversy about this because SOE's records are so incomplete. And recently I received a letter from somebody who'd read the book. One or two people do. And he was the man instructed by Templar to prepare a parachute. Now this is a very responsible gentleman indeed. And he was astonished to read that the operation went ahead. Because when he went to the general and said, "Sir, I cannot manufacture a parachute that will fail, the enemy will see through it," General Templar said, "Forget it. The whole operation's been cancelled because it contravenes the Prisoner of War Act." But that is not what he said to me. And ultimately, this code was found on the body of a German. And we broadcast tens of thousands of dummy groups to waste the time of the enemy, to convince them there was, in fact, an active resistance movement where none existed. And at the same time, and I know now one has to be very rapid, one was privileged to meet people like the White Rabbit, whom I believe was the greatest single agent of the war. His name was E.O. Thomas. He was a Molyneux dress designer who joined the resistance movement about the age of 40, broke every rule there was devoted to General de Gaulle. A man whose courage cannot actually be described. He went into the field and the Germans knew who he was, and there was a huge price on his head. But he had a friend called Brossolette, a very well-known Frenchman, with a white forelock, and Brossolette had dyed his forelock. And Tommy knew, because the Germans had caught Brossolette, that the dye would wear off in a couple of weeks and they would realize whom they'd caught. So he came storming into my office and said, I'm going back to France. I'm going to break open Friend prison. I'm going to get him out. And if you oppose my application, I will never talk to you again. Well, to go in was certain death. So I assured him I had no intention of opposing his application to go in. I was only too glad to get rid of him. And this great patriot persuaded SOE to let him go into the field. And before he left, he came into my office and said, "You've never written an original composition for me. Why not?" And I said, "Because you're too damned obstinate to learn it. That's why not." So he said, "Try me." So I held one out to him, and he said, "No, read it." So I did. They cannot know what makes you as you are, nor can they hear those voices from afar which whisper to you, you are not alone. They cannot reach that inner core of you, the long before of you, the child inside, deep, deep inside, which gives the man his pride. What you are, they can never be. And what they are will soon be history. And when Pierre Brossolette heard on the grapevine that Tommy was coming in to rescue him, he threw himself out of a window rather than let Tommy do it. And then they caught the great white rabbit. I will not tell you now what they did to him, except that they did not break Ear Thomas, the white rabbit. Now I'm receiving looks which say it is time to let you go for your dinner. There is one thing I would like to put to you. One tries to recapture the humor, the sadness of bravery beyond description. Not that the agents would ever consider themselves brave, because they didn't. And one tries to do justice to the extraordinary contribution made by the Americans, who were a nightmare because they made every single mistake we made and a few we hadn't thought of. But when it was time to say goodbye, SOE, I had to stay behind rather longer to do a rather special job. And on the very last day, when I wanted to sign off, I went back to my old office just to look at it. And it was once again in the hands of the agents. And I walked into it. And this was where one had discovered why the whole of the Dutch resistance movement was in enemy hands. But it took me 12 months to persuade SOE of it, for which I will never forgive myself. And this was where the white rabbit used to come and steal the cigars I'd stolen from Father. And this is where Templar Strode and Operation Periwig was formed. And so much else happened. And it was almost derelict. And I'd resolved never to write another poem, because too many agents had died because of them. But looking round this derelict office, I felt one coming on. Naturally, had no pencil or paper, but there was a blackboard and a piece of chalk. So I went to that blackboard and I wrote on it the last poem I resolved ever to write. We listen round the clock for a code called peacetime. But will it ever come? And shall we know it when it does, and break it once it's here, this code called peacetime? Or is its message such that it cannot be absorbed unless its text is daubed in letters made of lives from an alphabet of death, each consonant a breath expired before its time? Signal master, whose commandments were in clear, must you speak to us in code once peacetime is here? Thank you. I have a lot of questions for you. Have you any for me? Sir.
Were you aware of the ultra secret during the war, and did your work relate to that or impact on it?
We were aware of it, but we had no official connection with Bletchley. We were completely self-contained. Some of the things that we discovered about inventing codes and breaking one or two apparently were of great help to Bletchley, and we had a very close, unofficial relationship. But they won the war. We succeeded, apparently, according to Eisenhower, in shortening it by 3 months. Sir.
Some writers seem to think that SOE as a whole was a terrible disaster. How do you look at SOE as, say, a sound strategy?
The book describes the impression SOE made on me, and I do not retract it. SOE in its adolescence was pitted and pockmarked with improbable people doing implausible things for imponderable reasons and succeeding by coincidence. Eisenhower's assessment that we shortened the war by 3 months was true. We were, in fact, in many ways, a disaster. We were amateurs. But when you brief an agent on a Monday and on a Friday his eyes are taken out with a fork, you become professional very fast. And we caused the enemy a very, very great deal of trouble, which, in coding terms, has only just been revealed. We did shorten the war. Sir? Well, if you're being searched in the street, the Germans run their hands over you. They can't feel silk in the first place. Secondly, it's very easy to cut if it's specially impregnated, and it can easily be burnt. We occasionally were obliged to use not just silk but waterproof paper, but it was immensely practical, easy to camouflage, and it was camouflaged in a variety of objects. It was practical and specially impregnated. Yes?
Could you just technically explain how codes work?
If we have a year together.
What's the basic... I mean, you talked about the agents having poems. Was that sort of... Did the poem serve as a key?
No, from the poems, you've got some figures which you jumbled. And having jumbled them, you then jumble the letters of the message you want to send. Now, it would be an insult to you and an impossibility for me to attempt to describe codes and how they work at this particular session. But thank you for asking. I'm glad you want to know. Madam.
Did you know what the Russians were doing at this time.
The Russians didn't, I know. Yes, we had a certain working relationship with the Russians, and a quite extraordinary experience, although I probably am overrunning badly. We had an extraordinary experience in Yugoslavia, but I fear this is not the moment for it. Yes, we had a working relationship. They were very interested in us, with good reason. Sir?
Vila Szabo had a daughter that was about 2 years old when she was killed. Do you have any idea whatever happened to her?
Yes. Yes. Her name was Tanya Szabo, and she felt that anything her mother could do, she could do better. And there were one or two problems with Tanya. A very intelligent girl, indeed. Yes, we know what happened to her. Yes. Sir?
Did you ever encounter the agent, I believe his name was Garbo, the Spanish national, or?
I know the one to which you're referring. Happily did not have to brief that one, but know a little about him. Does he interest you?
What impression of his character did you take?
I didn't brief him.
So you had no personal...
No, wasn't necessary.
Of what his personality was
No,
like?
it wasn't necessary. It wasn't part of SOE's mandate.
Mr. Monks, we should end then, and then allow
Right.
you to sign books.
Oh,
Thank you very much.
thank you.
I'm going to let Mr. Marks sit here to sign books. The books are up front. And I would just...
Wayne and Judy. I just got Judy.
Judy.
Wayne and Judy. Who are they?
My in-laws.
Do you find this interesting?
Oh, very incredibly. And this is to Mary and Bill.
Mary and Bill.
Got nothing from me, right? I think you've been the best speaker I've heard in a long time.
You were
It's
a very good
unfortunate
audience.
it was only an hour.
Hello.
I wanted to comment that silk has very, very long, you may know this, a long history of carrying messages, and that throughout the Arabic world, warriors used to carry
Yes.
special messages to protect them. Yeah. Yeah. And also, silk has a very high tensile strength, which makes it, if you take a strand of silk and a strand of steel of the same diameter, the silk is stronger.
Yes, it was invaluable.
Yeah, yeah. So it's not a, we think of it as a luxury fabric, but it's
Sure.
very practical.
Absolutely.
I enjoyed your talk.
Thank you indeed.
It was great today. I worked at Arlington Hall during that war. Oh, my name's Ted. Just
Just to Ted.
Yeah, just write it to me. Thank you very, very much.
Great pleasure. Yes.
Wonderful lecture this evening.
And I'm giving one as a gift and keeping one myself. I'm the chair of the IEEE Technical Committee on Security and Privacy. And my successor is a great crippy, so I'm sure
Great.
you'll love this book.
Good.
So if you would inscribe it, please, to Tom Burson.
Tom, how do you...
Tom, and the surname is Berson. Berson, yes.
Yes.